Hey guys, tonight we're going to sit with a marriage. It began in a minister's front room in Dakota Territory on a Tuesday morning in 1885. Within the first 4 years of it, the couple buried a son who was never given a name. 16 days after the burial, their house burned to the ground. And before either of those things, a disease went through both of them and left the husband on a cane. He was 31 when that happened. He used the cane for the next 61 years. The wife was Laura Ingalls Wilder. If you have read the Little House books, you have never read a word of any of it. The 8 books end on her wedding day. These happy golden years closes on the ride out to the new little house, on a young woman looking at the future and finding it good, and then it stops. The marriage did not stop. It ran 64 years and 2 months, and it ended on a Sunday morning in October of 1949 in a farmhouse in Missouri, 800 miles south of that front room. Tonight we're going to walk all of it. If these long nights are useful to you, and only if you genuinely enjoy them, subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what hour it is there. The books are at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, the QR code is on the screen. On a phone, the link sits in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you for choosing this room. If you drift off before the fire, good. I will keep watch. So, the front room. The date was the 25th of August, 1885. The house belonged to Edward Brown, a congregational minister in the town of Smet. The bride was 18. The groom put $10 in the minister's hand, and the two of them went home. 4 days later, the Smet leader printed one line about it. Mr. Almanzo J. Wilder and Miss Laura Ingalls, both of Smet. That was all. One line in a small-town paper, in a town that had existed for 6 years. Most of what people repeat about that morning comes from a novel Laura wrote 50 years later, and not from a record. What the record holds is small and hard. There is the newspaper line, there is the minister's name, there is the date. What the novel holds is warmer. In these happy golden years, the wedding is small because Almanzo's mother and his sister Eliza Jane were coming out from Minnesota to put on a church wedding, and he did not want one, and he could not pay for one. So they moved it up. They went to the minister's house on a weekday morning and got it done before the family arrived. That story may be true. It sounds like them. But there is no letter and no diary that confirms it, and the novel even gets the day of the week wrong. It says Thursday. The 25th of August, 1885, was a Tuesday. The same is true of the most quoted moment of the whole ceremony. In the novel, Laura asks Almanzo beforehand whether the word obey has to be in the vows. He tells her no. He says he knows it is in the ceremony, but that it is only something women say, and that he never knew one who did it, nor any decent man who wanted her to. People love that exchange. It has been reprinted in magazines and on public television. It has been used for 100 years as proof of the kind of man he was, and it may well have happened exactly that way. But it exists in one place only, and that place is fiction shaped from memory half a century afterward. There is no minister's note, there is no letter, so we will hold it the way you hold something that might be true, gently and without leaning on it. We do not even know for certain how old the groom was. Almanzo James Wilder gave his birth year as 1857. That is the year on his death certificate, and Laura is the one who supplied it. But the federal census and the New York State census both point to 1859. The Wilder family Bible, which would have settled it, was destroyed. There is a plain reason he might have added 2 years to himself. In 1879, he filed on Dakota land, and a man had to be 21 to do that. So he was 28 that morning, or he was 26. Laura was 18. She had turned 18 in February. For the rest of tonight, I will use the year he gave, 1857, because that is the year on the certificate, but keep the doubt in your pocket. She had already been a school teacher. That part is real, though the books move it earlier than the paper does. Her 3rd grade teaching certificate was issued on the 10th of December, 1883 by private examination, and it is on display today in Missouri. The Bushi School term followed that winter. 2 months of teaching, $20 a month, in an abandoned claim shanty with walls that were never battened, 6 homemade desks and 1 stove, $40 for the season. Most of it went toward keeping her blind sister Mary at the college in Iowa. That is the girl who married him, 18 years old, and already sending her wages to a sister. And it is worth staying with that school term for a minute, because it is where the marriage actually begins. The Bushi School stood out on the open prairie southwest of Smet. How far out is one of the small unresolved questions of this story. The historical marker says about 12 miles. A researcher who has worked through the land office records puts the district closer to 6. Either way, it was far enough that a young teacher could not come home at night, so she boarded with a family out there, in a house with a woman who was not glad to have her. Laura was miserable. That much comes through every version she ever wrote. And every Friday afternoon through that winter term, a bachelor farmer she barely knew drove a sleigh out from town to bring her home for the weekend and drove her back on Sunday. He was not courting her, or he said he was not. In the novel, she asks him why he does it, and he tells her that sometimes a fellow gets tired of sitting around and that 2 old bachelors get pretty dull by themselves. That is the only reason he ever gave, and it comes to us through fiction, so we should not build a monument on it. But the driving itself is not in doubt, and neither is the weather. There is one ride we can put a temperature on, because Laura described it in her autobiography rather than in a novel. She remembered being caught out in a cutter in a storm at 45 degrees below zero. Not 45 degrees, 45 below. Understand what that is. At 45 below, an open sleigh is a moving refrigerator. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath freezes on scarves and eyelashes. Horses have to be watched constantly because a lathered horse in that air will chill and die. There is no cab, no heater, no windscreen, and nothing between a person and the cold but wool and hay and whatever the horses have left in them. He made that drive out and back week after week for a girl who had not yet said yes to anything. The horses were called Barnum and Skip. They come down to us by name, which almost nothing else from that winter does. Barnum was the difficult one. Sometime in 1884 he gave her a ring. It was gold, a flat oval setting, a garnet with a pearl on each side of it. She wore it on her first finger rather than the fourth, and she wore it for the rest of her life, and it is photographed and it survives. You will read in places that she tried to give it back to him and thought better of the whole engagement and nearly ended it. That story is not in her autobiography. It is not in the novels. It is not in the research on the ring. It appears to have come out of the television series in the 1970s and then wandered into the history. Set it aside. What is real is the arithmetic of the two of them. She was 16 or 17 through that winter. He was somewhere around 10 years older, an established landholder with 2 claims and a good team, and he had already done the thing everyone in that town remembered him for. In the terrible winter of 1880 and 1881, the trains had stopped and Smet was running out of food. He and another young man went out onto the frozen prairie to find a homestead rumoured to be holding seed wheat. They came back with it. So the town knew who he was. He was the one who went out. That is a useful thing to hold on to tonight, because for the next 64 years, going out is more or less what he does. When the crop fails, he goes out. When the disease takes his legs, he goes out slower. When they have nothing left in Dakota, he goes out again, 650 miles, at a walking pace, beside a wagon. He was not a brilliant man, and he was not a lucky one. Nearly every financial decision in this marriage went against them. But when the situation called for somebody to get up and cross a distance in bad conditions, he got up. They did not go far after the ceremony. Almanzo had 2 pieces of land north of town, both filed on the same day in 1879. There was the homestead, and there was the tree claim. He had built a new house on the tree claim, and that is where they went that afternoon. A tree claim was its own kind of gamble. The government would give a man a quarter section if he planted trees on 10 acres of it and kept them alive. On that prairie, keeping 10 acres of saplings alive was closer to a prayer than a plan. They moved to the homestead about a year later. In April of 1888, they moved back to the tree claim. In 1888, they also converted that tree claim to a preemption, which meant paying cash for land instead of proving up trees on it. You can read the whole first years of the marriage in those filings. Two young people moving between two houses on two pieces of ground, trying to find the arrangement that would let them keep either one. Rose was born on the 5th of December, 1886, in the shanty on the hilltop homestead. She was their first child, and though nobody knew it then, she would be the only one who lived. Now the ground begins to move under them. The first thing to go was the barn. On the 16th of July, 1887, the Smet leader reported that fire had destroyed Almanzo Wilder's barn, along with the hay and the grain that were in it. That is a sentence worth unpacking, because a modern reader hears barn and thinks of a building. On a Dakota farm in 1887, the barn was the bank. It held the hay that would keep the horses and the cows alive through a winter that could run 6 months. It held the grain, which was both the next crop and the next year's food. It sheltered the animals, and the animals were the engine of everything, because without a working team a man cannot plough, cannot haul, cannot get to town, cannot do anything at all. They lost the building, the winter feed, and the stored grain in July, with the whole cold season still ahead of them. That was 2 years into the marriage. Rose was 7 months old. They rebuilt because there was no alternative, and the rebuilding cost money they did not have to spare, and it came off the same account that was already thinning as the rain failed. On the 21st of July, 1888, Almanzo sold the homestead. The buyer was a man named Ira Dexter. The price was $1,200. $1,200 was real money. It was more than either of them had ever held. And selling the homestead, the piece he had proved up and finalled on only 4 years earlier, is not what a man does in a good year. He had been farming wheat. The rains had begun to fail. Weather scientists reading the Dakota record now can see the pattern in it. The wet cycle that pulled homesteaders out onto that prairie in the early 1880s, and the dry cycle that closed in behind them. The plough had followed the rain, then the rain left. They took the $1,200 and they kept farming. Somewhere in the spring of that same year, 1888, diphtheria came into the house. Both of them caught it. Both of them were young and strong, and both of them survived it, which in that decade was not the ordinary outcome. Diphtheria killed children mostly, and it killed them by growing a membrane across the throat until they could not draw air. There was no antitoxin. There was no vaccine. There was nothing to give a family except time and the hope that the fever would break. The fever broke. Laura recovered. Almanzo did not, all the way. What happened to him afterward has a name, and it is worth using the right one because the wrong one has been in circulation for 50 years. It was not a stroke. The television show gave him a stroke, and the television show is where that word comes from. It is repeated now on 100 websites, none of which can point to a doctor's note or a letter or a single line written at the time. What he had was diphtheritic neuritis. It is a recognized late complication of the disease. The bacterium releases a toxin, the toxin travels, and weeks after the throat is cleared it goes to work on the peripheral nerves. In the legs it produces weakness, and sometimes partial paralysis, and sometimes it fades, and sometimes it does not. His did not fade. The account that has come down from Minnesota, where his parents lived, is that he went back to work too soon and lost ground he never recovered. That account comes from a local historical society, and not from a physician, so hold it loosely. But the outcome is not in doubt. He was 31 years old, or he was 29, depending on which birth year you believe. He walked with a limp from that spring forward. He carried a cane for the rest of his life. He could not do the heavy work of a wheat farm anymore, and heavy work on a wheat farm was the entire economic basis of everything they owned. Laura was 21. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment, because it is the hinge the whole marriage turns on. She had married a strong young man 2.5 years before. She now had a husband who would need a stick to cross a yard, a daughter of 16 months, a failing crop, and a piece of prairie that had stopped taking water. They stayed. There was nowhere else to go and nothing else to try. Then came 1889, and 1889 took everything. On the 13th of July, the Smet leader ran a small item in the local column. Dr. Hunter reports the arrival of a 10-pound boy at A.J. Wilder's. That is the whole notice, give or take the night of the week, which researchers reading the same faded column have transcribed 2 different ways. So he was born in the 2nd week of July, 1889, and that is as close as anyone can honestly get. A 10-pound boy is a big, healthy baby. Dr. Hunter thought it was worth telling the paper about. In a town that size, the arrival of a strong son to a young couple who had been through a hard year was good news, and somebody wanted it in print. He lived about 4 weeks. On the 10th of August, the same paper printed the other line. Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Wilder's little child died Wednesday evening. That was the 7th of August, 1889. Laura wrote about it once, decades later, in the first 4 years, the same novelised manuscript she never published and never authorised. In it, the baby is taken with spasms and dies so quickly that the doctor is too late. That is memory shaped into fiction 40 years on, and it is the only account we have. And there is one more account from inside the family. Laura's youngest sister Grace kept a journal. On the 27th of August 1889, Grace sat down and wrote out everything that had happened. A great many things have happened since I last wrote in this book, she began. Then, a few lines on, this. Laura's little baby boy, only a month old, died a little while ago. He looks just like Manly. He looks just like Manly. That is a 12-year-old girl writing about her nephew, and it is very nearly the only physical description of that child that exists anywhere. He was big. He was healthy at birth. He looked like his father. He was never given a name. That is not a gap in the record. That is the record. There is no baptismal entry, no name in the paper, no name in Laura's manuscript, no name in Grace's journal. The stone that stands over him in the Smet cemetery today reads, Baby, son of A.J. Wilder, and that stone was not set until 1958, 69 years after he died, by a memorial group. Even the exact plot is uncertain. There is correspondence from 1943 between Laura, then in her 70s, and the Cemetery Association, still trying to establish exactly where her son was buried. 54 years later, she still did not know for certain which patch of ground held him. That is one thing the 8 books do not contain. 16 days after the baby died, on the 23rd of August 1889, the house on the tree claim caught fire and burned to the ground. Grace wrote that down too, 4 days after it happened. Last Friday, Manly's house caught fire and burned to the ground. The 27th was a Tuesday. The Friday before was the 23rd. How it started is one of the genuine unsolved questions of this marriage, and it is unsolved because 2 different people confessed to it. In the first 4 years, the manuscript Laura wrote and never published, Laura blames herself. She lit the kitchen stove and there was hay near it that Almanzo had brought in, and it went up. In 1926, in a magazine, Rose blamed herself. She wrote that it was she, alone in the kitchen and helpfully trying to put more wood in the stove, who set fire to the house. Rose was 2 years and 8 months old at the time. In the article, she says she was 3. Both women were writing decades afterward. One of them was the mother of a dead infant 16 days into her grief, and the other was a small child who grew into a professional storyteller of formidable and not always reliable imagination. There is no third account. There is no fire report. It cannot be resolved, and anyone who tells you it can is choosing a side rather than reading a document. What we know is that a young family with a 16-day-old grave stood outside and watched their house burn. One thing came out of it whole. 4 Christmases earlier, in their first winter as a married couple, Almanzo had bought Laura a set of glassware, a sugar bowl, a spoon holder, a butter dish, 6 sauce dishes, and a bread plate. It was pressed glass out of Pittsburgh, made by McKee and Brothers in a pattern called City. Around the rim of the bread plate, raised in the glass, were heads of wheat and a motto: "Give us this day our daily bread." The bread plate survived the fire. It survived the fire, and it survived the 4 moves that came after it, and the 650 miles of wagon road, and the 60 years of farmhouse living that followed. It is in a display case in Mansfield, Missouri tonight. You can go and look at it. A young husband bought it for a young wife in a Dakota winter as a piece of ordinary domestic hopefulness. It outlasted every single thing that happened to them, and it carries a sentence about daily bread, chosen in a year when they were about to lose everything. Remember the plate. We will come back to it. Now count what the first 4 years of the marriage had done. They had married in August of 1885 with land, health, and a new house. By the end of August 1889, the homestead was sold, the husband was permanently lamed, the crops had failed in a drought that showed no sign of turning, the sun was in the ground, the house was ash, and the tree claim they had left was mortgaged. Laura was 22 years old. Almanzo was 32 or 30. Rose was 2. They sold the preemption in 1890 with the mortgage still on it. This is the part that people who only know the books cannot quite absorb. The 8 novels end with a young woman on a wedding day, riding out to a little house with a good man, and the whole architecture of that ending tells you she has arrived. The hard years are behind her. Pa's fiddle has played her out. The hard years had not started. What she actually had in front of her on the 25th of August, 1885, was 4 years of catastrophe, then 4 years of wandering, then 40 years of building a farm out of a hillside in a state she had never seen, with a husband who could not walk without help. And here is the thing that is easy to miss, so let us be plain about it before we go any further tonight. The story of this marriage is not really a tragedy, though it starts like one. Almost everything they touch between 1885 and 1890 failed. Almost everything they touched after 1894 held. The difference between those 2 halves is the story. We know how they addressed each other. She called him Manly. He called her Bess from her middle name, Elizabeth, and to distinguish her from his sister, who was also called Laura. Those names run through everything either of them wrote for 60 years. The origin of them is family tradition rather than documented fact, but the use of them is beyond doubt. Manly and Bess. There is a letter from 30 years into this marriage that tells you exactly what those 2 names were worth, and we will read it in its proper place. But we are not there yet. In 1890 they were in Dakota with nothing left, and the question in front of them was not how to be happy. It was where to go. The answer came from his parents. James and Angeline Wilder had left New York years before and settled in Spring Valley in southern Minnesota, on a farm at the edge of town they had bought in 1873. They were comfortable in a way their son was not. In May of 1890, Almanzo and Laura and Rose left Dakota Territory and went to live with them. They were going there so that Almanzo could get well. That is the reason every account gives, and it is the reason that matters, because it tells you what they still believed in 1890. They believed the legs would come back. They believed that a summer and a winter of rest in his mother's house would undo what the diphtheria had done, and that they would return to farming a full-sized farm, and that the last 5 years had been an accident rather than a direction. They stayed a year and a half. He did not get well. The record of that year and a half is thin, and it is worth saying so out loud, because there are versions of this story that fill it with detail nobody can support. We do not know what work Almanzo did in Spring Valley, if he did any. No document names an employer, a wage, or a task. What we have is a church. James and Angeline were Methodists, and the family attended the Methodist Church in Spring Valley, and the church records place them there through 1890 and 1891. The building still stands. It holds a Wilder exhibit now. So we can put them in a pew, and we can put them under his mother's roof, and past that the year goes quiet. What we know is how it ended. It ended with them deciding that the cold was the problem. His lungs had been damaged. The Dakota winters had nearly finished him twice. Somebody proposed the obvious remedy, which was to take him somewhere it did not get cold, and in October of 1891 they got on a train and went to Florida. She was 24, he was 34 or 32. They had a 4-year-old, and they had lost a homestead, a preemption, a son, and a house. Now they were about to try the one thing they had not tried, which was leaving the country they came from entirely. It went worse than Dakota. The place they went to was not Westville, although Westville is the name that ended up on everything. They went to a settlement called Poplar Head, in Holmes County, in the far northwest corner of the Florida Panhandle, about 18 miles north and slightly west of the town of Westville. There is a marker there now, on a county road, put up by a Historical Alliance and the County Historical Society. It sits at a set of coordinates in the Pine Woods, and it tells you that Laura Ingalls Wilder lived here. They went because family was already there. Peter Franklin Ingalls was Laura's first cousin. He is sometimes described as her uncle, including by people who ought to know better, and he was not. He was the son of Laura's uncle Peter. He had gone south in an unusual way. In October of 1890, he and Laura's cousin Joseph Quiner Carpenter and Almanzo's own brother Pearlie Day Wilder had set out from Stockholm, Wisconsin, and sailed down the Mississippi River in a boat called the Edith. 3 young men from the northern prairie in a sailboat, going down the whole Mississippi to find warm country. They ended in the Florida piney woods, and Peter married a local woman named Mary Edith McGowan, who went by Molly, and settled in. And when the news reached Dakota that Almanzo's lungs were bad, and that the family had run out of options, Peter had land and a house and an invitation. The plan was farming: corn, cotton, peanuts, sweet potatoes. Almanzo would work in warm air and his chest would clear and his legs would come back and they would start again. They lasted a little less than a year. Laura wrote about Florida twice in her life, and both times briefly, and both times you can feel her trying to be fair about a place she could not stand. In a short autobiographical sketch she described it like this: the piney woods of Florida, where the trees always murmur, where the butterflies are enormous, where plants that eat insects grow in moist places, and alligators inhabit the slowly moving waters. That is a beautiful sentence. It is also the sentence of a woman describing a foreign country. And then, immediately after it, she wrote the line that actually explains the year. A Yankee woman was more of a curiosity than any of these, more of a curiosity than the murmuring trees, more than the enormous butterflies, more than the carnivorous plants and the alligators. That was the problem. Not the heat, though the heat was real, and the marker at the site says plainly that she could not tolerate the humidity. The deeper problem was that she was looked at. The scholarship on this period makes the point carefully. Laura came into that community dressed as a northern woman of 1891 dressed. Leg of mutton sleeves, a hat. She carried an umbrella into the field while she planted corn for the shade, because that is what a woman of her upbringing did. And the people around her had never seen anything like it, and they watched. She was 24 years old. She had buried a baby 2 years earlier. She'd watched her house burn. She had left her mother and her 3 sisters 800 miles behind her. She was living in a cousin's house, in a state she had no connection to, in weather that made her ill, married to a man who could not do the work they had come for. And she was a curiosity. There is a version of this story that gets told sometimes, in which Laura hated the Florida people and thought them ignorant and dangerous, and there are supposed quotations to that effect. Those quotations do not appear in anything she is documented as having written. I have looked. The honest position is narrower and sadder. She was lonely in a way she had not been lonely before, and she was watched, and she wanted to go home. The one piece of that year that turned into something is not hers. Rose was 4 and 5 years old in Florida, and 30 years later she made it into fiction. Her story about the Florida piney woods, called Innocence, ran in Harper's Monthly in April of 1922 and took second prize in the O. Henry Awards that year. It is a strange, dark, adult piece of work. It is one of the earliest pieces of evidence that the child in that household was watching everything and would spend her life turning it into copy. In August of 1892, they gave up on Florida and went back to Smet. Think about what that return meant. They had left Dakota in 1890 with the land gone and the child in the ground and the house burned. They had gone to his parents to get well, and he had not gotten well. They had gone to Florida to get well, and he had not gotten well. And now they were coming back into the same small town where everybody knew exactly what they had lost, with a 5-year-old and no land at all. They came back and they went to work. The records here are thin, but they point the same direction. Laura worked as a dressmaker. Almanzo worked as a carpenter. That is the official summary from the State Historical Society in Missouri, and it is about all we can safely say. You will find a very specific figure attached to that dressmaking in a great many retellings. $1 a day, 12 hours a day. It is repeated constantly. I could not verify it in any primary source or in any cited scholarship, and I do not think anybody else can either, so we will not use it. What we can say is this. A woman who had run a household on a failing wheat farm was now sowing for wages in town. A man who had proved up his own homestead was now hired out with a hammer. Neither of them owned the roof they slept under. Where exactly that roof was is also disputed. The land researcher who has gone through the deeds says they bought a small house on 4th Street for $200 and held it for the 2 years. Other accounts say they rented. The deed reading is the more specific claim, so it is probably the better one. They stayed 2 years, and in those 2 years they did something that is easy to say in a sentence and was very hard to do. They saved $100. 2 adults, working for wages in a small Dakota town in the middle of the 1890s, with a child, and they put aside $100 in cash. That is not a story about luck. That is 24 months of not spending. Meanwhile, the decision was forming. People were leaving Dakota. The drought had not broken, and there was talk, the way there is always talk, about a place where it was better. This time the place was southern Missouri, the Ozarks, cheap land, water, fruit trees, a growing season that did not try to kill you. A De Smet man named Frank Cooley went down ahead of them to arrange it. He came back or sent word, and the Cooleys and the Wilders decided to go together. On the 17th of July, 1894, they left De Smet. Laura was 27, Almanzo was 37 or 35. Rose was 7.5. They had $100, a wagon, a team, and a child, and they were going 650 miles overland to a state none of them had seen. And this is where the record suddenly gets very good, because Laura kept a diary. It was a 5-cent memorandum book, and she wrote in it in pencil, not a journal in the literary sense, a log. Weather, roads, distances, crop conditions, the prices of things, the temperature, until the thermometer got lost. It is one of the plainest documents she ever produced, and it is the closest we will ever get to standing beside her in that summer. That little book is at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa today. It was published in 1962, 5 years after her death, as On the Way Home. They went south and east, down through Nebraska into Kansas, across into Missouri. On the 13th of August, near Rossville, Kansas, her horse was startled by railroad cars. On the 20th of August, she wrote this: "Got a good start at 7:30, but the roads are awfully stony." And then the thing she noticed everywhere that summer, which was that the people they passed reported not enough rain for the crops. She was riding through a drought to escape a drought. On the 21st of August, she wrote a line that tells you what the whole road looked like. The whole country is just full of emigrants, going and coming, going and coming. That is the part people forget about the American westward movement. It was not one direction. For every wagon heading out to try a new country, there was a wagon heading back from one that had failed. In the summer of 1894, the roads of Nebraska and Kansas held both, passing each other in the dust. The Wilders were in the middle of it, and every family on that road had a version of the 9 years the Wilders had just lived. 6 weeks is a long time, and almost nobody thinks about what it was actually like. They were not pioneers in a wilderness. This was 1894. There were roads, of a sort, and towns, and railway lines they crossed and recrossed. What they were doing was closer to a very slow, very uncomfortable relocation than to an adventure. A good day was 15 or 20 miles. Some days were much less, because the wagon moved at the speed of the team and the road she kept complaining about was stony. They started around 7:30 in the morning. They stopped when the light or the horses gave out. They camped, or they paid a small sum to sleep in somebody's yard. They cooked over a fire. Every night they had to find water for the animals, and every morning they had to catch and harness them again. There was a 7-year-old girl in the wagon for all of it. And this is where you feel the diary most, because of what is in it and what is not. What is in it is a farmer's inventory. Laura wrote down the price of oats. She wrote down what the crops looked like in each county, and how much rain the locals said they had got, and whether the corn was made or burned. She noted the state of the roads and the temperature until the thermometer was lost somewhere in Kansas. She was not sightseeing, she was assessing. 2 people who had lost 4 farms in 9 years were driving through 800 miles of other people's country, reading it, the way a person reads a room they might have to live in. Every field they passed was data. Every man they talked to at a well was a source. What is not in the diary is complaint. There is no self-pity in that little book. There is no reflection on the son they were leaving behind in the Smet cemetery, or on the house that had burned, or on the fact that a woman of 27 was starting over for the 5th time. There is the price of oats and the state of the road. That is not because she did not feel any of it. It is because she was the kind of person who logged the oats. The country they were crossing was in the middle of a drought too. The reports she collected as they went were bad. And then, gradually as they got down into southern Missouri, the reports changed and the roadside changed with them. And then the diary changes. Because on the 29th of August, still on the road, she wrote about masses of blackberries and seedling peaches and plums and cherries, fruit, growing wild, by the side of the road, for free, in quantity. For a woman who had spent 9 years watching things fail to grow, and 1 year watching them grow in a place she could not bear, a hillside of wild blackberries in late August is not scenery. It is evidence. It is the land telling her what it can do without being asked. On the 30th of August, 1894, 44 days after leaving Smet, they came into Mansfield, Missouri. Mansfield in 1894 was a railroad town of a few hundred people in the Missouri Ozarks, about 50 miles east of Springfield. It had a square. It had stores and a hotel and churches and a depot. It was not frontier and it was not prosperous. It was an ordinary small American town of the kind that existed by the thousand, which is exactly what made it survivable. That marks the real break with everything that came before. Every place the Wilders had tried to live until that summer had been an experiment. Dakota Territory in the 1880s was an experiment, and the experiment was whether wheat could be grown on a semi-arid plain by people who had been told it could. Florida was an experiment. Even Smet itself had been 6 years old when Laura married in it. Mansfield was not an experiment. It was a town that already worked. They had spent 9 years betting on places that were being invented and losing. Now they walked into a place that had already been proved by somebody else, and they never left it again. Now we have to deal with the $100 bill, because it is the most famous story in this part of their lives, and most of what you have heard about it is wrong. The core of it is true. In the 3 weeks between arriving in Mansfield and buying land, that $100 bill went missing and was found again. The researcher working from the county deed record states it flatly and in passing, as an established fact. Everything else about it comes from Rose. Laura's diary stops on the day they arrived. When the diary was published in 1962, Rose wrote the opening and closing chapters that frame it, and the lost bill is her material, written by a woman in her 70s about something that happened when she was 7. In her telling, the money was kept in a small writing desk, a lap desk. It could not be found. They took the desk apart, searching every nook and cranny, and Rose, 7 years old, understood that she was being asked whether she had taken it out, and felt accused. Then it was found. That is as far as the evidence goes. You will hear that Laura had sewn it into the lining, that it had slipped through a crack in the wood, that it turned up weeks later, that a stranger found it and brought it back. None of those versions can be sourced to anything. They are the ordinary sediment that collects on a good story. But the detail that matters most is the one almost nobody corrects. The $100 did not buy the farm. Rose says it did. She wrote that $100 bought 40 acres, and that number has been repeated in books and on markers and in documentaries for 60 years. The deed says otherwise. On the 21st of September, 1894, Thomas M. White and Charlotte M. White sold 40 acres about a mile and a half east of Mansfield for $400. The buyer also took on an outstanding lien of $140 owed to the Stark Brothers Nursery. So the real price was close to $540, and the $100 bill was a down payment on a debt, not a purchase. The Whites, incidentally, had paid $375 for that land 6 months earlier. But there is something else in that deed, and it is the reason we have spent this long on a piece of paper. The buyer named on it is Laura E. Wilder, not Almanzo J. Wilder, not Mr. and Mrs. Laura E. Wilder, in her own name, alone, in September of 1894, in the state of Missouri, 9 years into a marriage, 26 years before American women had the vote. We do not know why. There's no letter explaining it. It may have been a legal convenience. It may have been about protecting the land from any debt still attached to him from Dakota. It may have been his decision, or hers, or a lawyer's. But it happened, and it did not happen by accident, and the pattern it starts does not stop. Every time in the next 50 years that this family had to put a name on money, it tended to be hers. The savings account, the loan association books, the publishing contracts, the last deed of all, in 1948. The farm they bought that day was 40 acres of Ozark hillside with rocks in it. There was a one-room log house standing near a ravine, and in the ravine there was a spring that ran all year. That was the real asset. Water that does not stop in August is worth more than flat ground in that country. And there were trees. An article published in 1912 looks back on this purchase. It says that when he bought the farm, there were 800 apple trees growing on it in nursery rows. 200 more had been set out the spring before, in an old worn-out field. The varieties were Ben Davis and Missouri Pippin. That article ran under the name A.J. Wilder. Laura wrote it. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter later. The first substantial piece of farm writing to come out of this marriage went out into the world under her husband's name, and it was hers, and nobody thought that was strange, least of all her. So, the last day of August, 1894, they came down into a valley with $100. 3 weeks later, they owned a hillside, a spring, a log house, and 1,000 young apple trees, and they owed $540 on it. He was 37 and walked with a cane. She was 27 and had buried a son. Between them, they had failed at everything they had tried for 9 consecutive years. They named the place Rocky Ridge Farm, which is not a romantic name. It is a description. It is what a person says when they walk the ground and see what they are actually dealing with. Who chose the name is not recorded, but the choice itself tells you something about that household. Laura had grown up inside her father's language. Charles Ingalls was a man who talked about the West as a place of promise, who moved again and again chasing better ground, who could make a bad year sound like a rehearsal for a good one. She had been carried across 4 states on the strength of that talk. She had watched it fail in Kansas, in Minnesota, in Iowa, and in Dakota. And when this couple finally bought a piece of land of their own, at 27 and 37, they looked at it and called it what it was. Rocky Ridge, not fair prospect, not sunny slope. A ridge with rocks in it. That is a person who has stopped expecting the land to be generous and has decided to work it anyway. The coolies, incidentally, are worth a sentence, because their part of this story is the one that usually gets left out. Frank Cooley had gone down to Missouri ahead of the group to arrange land for everybody. The arrangement fell apart. There was a problem with the title, which is the oldest problem in American land dealing, and the ground he had lined up could not be delivered clear. So the 2 families arrived in the Ozarks in the last days of August, 1894, and the plan that had brought them 650 miles was already dead. The Cooleys took over the Mansfield Hotel and went into the livery business in town. The Wilders went out to a hillside a mile and a half east and started again. That is the difference between the two responses, and it is not a moral judgment because the Cooleys did perfectly well, but the Wilders had now had a plan collapse under them 5 times in 9 years. Their response to the 6th collapse was to buy the worst-looking 40 acres in the district and to put a woman's name on the paper. They would live on that hillside for the rest of their lives, both of them. Every single day of the next 55 years for him and the next 63 for her. And this is where the whole shape of the story turns over, because everything up to this point has been loss. Land lost, child lost, house lost, health lost, 4 addresses in 4 years. And from this point forward, for almost 40 years, the story is the opposite. It is one long, slow, unglamorous accumulation carried out by 2 people in late middle age who had already been beaten badly enough to know exactly how little they could count on. They did not build that farm because they were confident. They built it because they had run out of places to run. The first winter they lived in the log house near the spring. The following spring in 1895 they added a room to it. In 1896 they moved that room physically to the site where the farmhouse stands today, and it became the kitchen. That is how the house began. Not with a plan and a builder, with one added room, picked up and carried to a better spot. It took them about 17 or 18 years to finish it. Not 17 years of building. 17 years of building whenever there was any money or any time, which on a farm like that meant late autumn and hard winter, when the fruit was in and the fields were finished. 2 rooms complete by the late 1890s, additions through 1912, 10 rooms at the end of it. 6 rooms and a bath on the ground floor, a living room with a small library off it, and a hall and 3 rooms above. Every board came off the place. Oak beams and oak boards cut on the farm, fieldstone for the foundation and the chimneys, picked up out of the ground they were trying to farm. That is the actual answer to why the ridge is called rocky. They were digging the stones out anyway. Almanzo did most of the construction himself, with local carpenters helping at intervals and Laura working beside him. A man with diphtheritic neuritis in both legs, who needed a stick to walk across a yard, built a 10-room house by hand over roughly 2 decades. Out of trees he cut and stones he lifted off his own fields. There is a fireplace on the north wall of that living room. It is faced with 3 large stones, and those 3 stones came off the farm, and they are big enough that moving them was a project. And in the kitchen, he built the cabinets and the work surfaces low. He built them low because his wife was a small woman, and standard counters were the wrong height for her, and she was going to be standing at them for the rest of her life. You can see it today. People walk into that kitchen and stop because the counters are visibly wrong for a modern adult, and then somebody explains and the room changes meaning. He could not do heavy field work anymore, so he made a house that fitted her. Before any of that could happen, they had to eat. The apple trees were the whole plan, and apple trees do not pay for 7 years. A nursery O seedling set out in 1895 is not a crop. It is a promise you make to yourself and then have to survive long enough to collect. The first real bearing year on that orchard was 1902. 1895 to 1902. 7 years of tending trees that produced nothing, so they sold wood. The 40 acres was timbered, and they were clearing it anyway, and there was a town a mile and a half down the road that needed to burn something. Almanzo cut and hauled and sold firewood at 50 cents a load. 50 cents a load. That is the founding economy of Rocky Ridge Farm. Not literature, not apples, not a homestead grant. A lame man with a wagon selling cordwood by the load to his neighbours, 1 load at a time for years. Around that they built the rest of it piece by piece. A dairy herd. Poultry, which became Laura's department and eventually her reputation. Goats. A garden. Then the fruit. Then more land, bought in parcels as the money allowed, until the 40 acres they walked onto in 1894 had grown to roughly 200. 200 acres, built out of 50-cent wood loads and 7 years of waiting. There is no dramatic moment in that. There is no year when it turned. That is exactly what makes it hard for a story to hold, and exactly why the books stop where they stop. A wedding is a scene. 35 years of small compounding decisions is not a scene. It is a life. And there was a person inside that house who experienced all of it as a slow suffocation. Rose Wilder was 7 when they arrived. She grew up on that hillside, in a house that was being built around her one room at a time, watching her parents count. And when she was a grown woman with an international career, she wrote about that childhood with a bitterness that is genuinely shocking to read. "I hated everything and everybody in my childhood," she wrote, "with such bitterness and resentment that I didn't want to remember anything about it. And then, more carefully and much worse, my father and mother were courageous, even gaily so. They did everything possible to make me happy, and I gaily responded with an effort to persuade them that they were succeeding. But all unsuspected, I lived through a childhood that was a nightmare. Read that again slowly because it is one of the most honest descriptions of a certain kind of childhood ever written by an American. They were brave and cheerful. She could see they were trying, so she performed happiness for them, so that they would think it was working. And underneath the performance she was in misery, and they never knew, because she was too kind and too proud to tell them. That is what poverty does inside a family that loves each other. Everybody protects everybody else from the truth, and everybody ends up alone. Rose left in 1905. She was 18, the same age her mother had been at that wedding. She went to Kansas City to work as a telegraph operator, and then to San Francisco, and then to Europe, and then to the Near East, and she did not come back to live for 23 years. Years later, she put the whole thing in one sentence. "If I'd ever made the best of things," she said, "my God, I'd be stuck in Mansfield yet." So there is the marriage at the turn of the century seen properly. 2 people in their 30s and 40s on a rocky hillside, building a house by hand, waiting on trees, selling wood by the load, with a daughter who loved them and could not get away from them fast enough. And they were, by every account including hers, happy, not comfortable, not successful, not secure. But the record from this point forward has no separations in it, no reported quarrels, no periods apart except the ones we can account for, and 60 more years of 2 people using each other's private names, Manly and Bess. The next 30 years are the ones that made Laura Ingalls Wilder into someone the world would eventually hear about, and the strange thing about them, the thing nobody expects, is that the writing did not start with the books. It started with chickens. Laura kept hens. That is not a charming detail. On a farm that was still waiting on its trees, poultry was one of the few things that produced cash every single week, and she was good at it. Good enough that other farmers started asking her how she did it. Good enough that by the end of the first decade of the new century, she had a regional reputation as somebody who knew what she was talking about. In 1910, a newspaper in Kansas City printed a piece by her about the economics of laying hens. It ran under the name Mrs. A.J. Wilder. One of them was called Profits of the Good Fat Hen. Another was about judgment with late chicks. She was 43 years old, and that is the first time her words were set in type for money. Then, in January of 1911, the University of Missouri held a Farmers' Week in Columbia, and inside it a conference for farm women. Laura was invited to give a paper. She could not go. We do not know exactly why. The farm, the distance, the cost. Whatever the reason, she wrote the paper and did not deliver it, and somebody else stood up and read it out to the room in her absence. Sitting in that room was a man named John Case, who edited a farm paper called the Missouri Ruralist. He heard a paper written by a woman who could not afford to come and say it herself, and he printed it the following month, the 18th of February 1911. That is the date her career actually starts, not 1932, not with a little house in the big woods, with a farm paper in Missouri, reprinting a talk she was not there to give. She was 44. She wrote for the Missouri Ruralist for the next 13 years, until 1924. She became its home editor. In 1916 alone, she produced 20 pieces. Her column was headed The Farm Home in 1919, and then As a Farm Woman Thinks in 1921, and she also sold work to McCall's and to the Country Gentleman and to a paper in St. Louis. For 13 years this woman was a working journalist, and here is the part that belongs to the marriage rather than to the career. Several of those early pieces went out under his name, A.J. Wilder, not Mrs. A.J. Wilder, just his initials, as though the man of the farm had written them, which he had not. That 1912 article about the apple orchard, the one that tells us there were 800 trees in Nursery Rows when they bought the place, is one of them. Nobody in that house appears to have thought this was a problem, including her. It is worth being careful about what that means, because it is easy to read it through a modern lens and get it wrong. This was not a woman being erased by her husband. This was a farm couple treating the farm as one enterprise with two hands on it, and using whichever name got the piece read by the people it needed to reach. She used her own name plenty. She signed as Mrs. A.J. Wilder for years, and then as Laura Ingalls Wilder, and by 1921 she had a bylined opinion column in a regional paper. But the fact remains, and it is a strange and rather touching fact. In the middle of this marriage there are essays about apple trees and farm economy, signed with a layman's initials. They were written by his wife. They are about the farm the two of them had built out of nothing, and neither of them ever bothered to correct the record. Now, we come to the year that gives us the best look we will ever get inside this marriage. In the summer of 1915, Rose was living in San Francisco and working as a newspaper writer, and there was a World's Fair on, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Rose wanted her mother to come and see it. She sent the money for the fair. Laura went. Almanzo stayed home to run the farm. She was gone about 2 months, and for those 2 months she wrote him letters. Long ones. They survived, and they were published in 1974 as West from Home. They are the only extended stretch of this marriage where we get to hear one of them speak directly to the other, and what is in them is not what people expect. There is no romance in the greeting card sense. There is very little sentiment. What is in them is a farm. "Don't buy the horse unless you are sure it is gentle," she writes him from San Francisco. "I do not want you hurt while I am gone, or any other time for that matter. That is a wife 2,000 miles from home. She knows her husband has bad legs and a habit of handling animals stronger than he is, so she tells him not to buy an unsettled horse while she's not there to see it." In another letter, she works through the trade with him properly. "If it is the horse you want," she writes, "I suppose it would be a good idea to exchange a horse as old as Buck for a 6-year-old. Read that again. She's at a World's Fair in California, and she's doing the arithmetic on the age of a workhorse for a farm in Missouri, because he wrote to ask her, because that is how they made decisions. And in the middle of all this practical business, on the 13th of September, she writes him a sentence that tells you exactly what she thought she had. "There is no place like the country to live," she says, "and I have not heard of anything so far that would lead me to give up Rocky Ridge for any other place." She had just seen San Francisco. She had seen the Pacific Ocean, and an international exposition, and a daughter with a real career in a real city. And she wrote home to a rocky hillside in Missouri to say that none of it had made her want to leave. But the letter that matters most in this whole collection is the first one. She started it on a train, somewhere between Denver and Salt Lake City, on the 25th of August, 1915. The 25th of August, 30 years to the day since a front room in Smet, and a congregational minister and $10. She was travelling west without him on their 30th wedding anniversary, and she began the letter with the name she'd used for him since she was 17 years old. "Manly dear," and then this, "I wish you were here. Half the fun I lose because I am all the time wishing for you. Half the fun. Not I miss you, not I love you. Something much more particular than that, and much harder to fake." She's saying that pleasure has stopped working properly on its own, that she can be looking at the Rocky Mountains from a train window at 48 years old and only get half of it, because the other half was always the part where she turned to him and said, "Look, 30 years, 1 dead child, 4 failed farms, and a fire," and the machinery of her enjoyment still ran through him. That is the marriage. Everything else in this episode is context for that line. Meanwhile, back on the ridge, he was breeding horses. This is the part of Almanzo Wilder that almost nobody knows, and it is the clearest window we have into what that man was actually like after the diphtheria took his legs. He never stopped keeping Morgans. Morgan horses were the American breed he had grown up with in New York, compact and strong and famously sure-footed. He had a work team called Buck and Billy. And sometime around 1922, in his mid-60s, he acquired a registered Morgan stallion. The horse was called Governor of Orleans, registration number 6866. A dark bay with a white left hind ankle, foaled in 1914, sired by a stallion called Ben Lamond, bred by a Vermont man named Joseph Battelle, who had spent his life trying to keep the Morgan line pure. Almanzo got him as an agent of the American Remount Association, which was a government-backed program to put good breeding stallions into the hands of ordinary farmers so the country would have decent horses if it needed them. By the time a farm writer came out to Rocky Ridge to look at the operation, that stallion had sired 23 colts in a single year, and the writer asked him why Morgans, and wrote down the answer. For many years, Almanzo said, we have been attempting to breed an ideal Ozark horse. The Morgan horse has that quality. It means good feet to withstand the stony roads and fields. Good feet to withstand the stony roads. A man who could not reliably stand on his own feet, on a farm named for its rocks, spent the last third of his life trying to breed an animal with better feet than the country deserved. He was in his 60s and 70s through most of it. He kept goats. He kept a large herd of cows. He gardened. He did carpentry and woodwork in a shop on the place. He learned to drive a car, and once he had, the two of them took long motor trips, out to California, up to the Pacific Northwest, back to South Dakota to see what was left of Smet. The man never sat down, and in 1919 Laura took a job. The Mansfield Farm Loan Association made her its secretary and treasurer, and she held that position for 8 years, until 1927. Understand what that was. Federal farm loan money came into a county through local associations. Somebody had to run the books, take the applications and keep the records. Somebody had to handle the paper for every farmer in the district who wanted to borrow against his land. That somebody, in Mansfield, was a woman in her 50s with no formal education past a country school. The museum that holds her papers says she processed more than $1 million in loans. $1 million in the 1920s, moving through the hands of a woman who had arrived in that county in a wagon with $100. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this that overstates it. We do not know what she was paid. No source I can find documents her salary, and I am not going to invent one. What we know is that the money from it was not enough to fix the farm's finances, and that she did the work for 8 years anyway. But the direction of the marriage had changed, and everyone in it could see it. He had married a girl who was teaching school to pay her sister's tuition. 35 years later, he was a farmer in his 60s with bad legs, and she was the one with the outside income, the public byline, and the county's loan books on her desk. There is no sign anywhere in the record that he minded. Then, in 1928, their daughter came home with money. Rose Wilder Lane, by that point, was one of the highest-paid women writers in America. She'd been a foreign correspondent, a Red Cross publicist in post-war Europe, a relief worker in Armenia, a resident of Albania. She came back to Mansfield in 1928, and she decided her parents were too old to be climbing the stairs of a 10-room farmhouse. So she built them a new one. She took the design from a Sears, Roebuck catalogue, an English cottage plan called the Mitchell. It was not a kit house. It was built on the property out of local stone. It had modern conveniences the farmhouse did not have. It was finished in December of 1928, and they moved into it around the middle of that month. Rose moved into the farmhouse herself and modernised it for her own use. You will read that the rock house cost $11,000. That figure circulates widely, and I could not find a primary source for it, so I will not give it to you as a fact. What is reasonably established is that Rose borrowed money from her parents to finish the job, which tells you something about how that household worked even when the daughter was the rich one. They lived in the rock house for about 8 years. Those 8 years in the rock house are the least examined stretch of this whole marriage, and there was a third person in the middle of them. Rose came home in 1928 at the age of 41, wealthy, famous in her field, and unwell in ways the family did not have language for. She took over the farmhouse, she modernised it, filled it with her own furniture, employed staff, entertained, and kept 2 young Albanian men she had more or less adopted in Europe. A third of a mile away, in a stone cottage she had built for them, were her parents, aged 61 and 71. Anyone who has ever tried to help an ageing parent by improving their living arrangements will recognise the shape of this immediately. Rose was not wrong. The farmhouse had stairs. Her parents were old. The cottage was warmer, easier, and more modern, and she paid for it. And her parents left it after 8 years and went home. There is no record of a quarrel about it. But look at the arrangement from inside that stone cottage. 2 people who had built a house with their own hands over 18 years were living in a house built for them, on land that had been theirs, watching their daughter live in their kitchen. She had done it out of love and out of money, and she had also, without meaning to, moved them out of the centre of their own lives. They were tenants of their own child's generosity. So in 1936, or possibly the summer before, they picked up and walked back into the farmhouse he had spent 18 years building with a cane in one hand. I do not think that was ingratitude. I think it was 2 very old people quietly reclaiming the last thing they had made. The reason that has come down to us is short and entirely believable. They were homesick for the old place. He was 79, she was 69. They had eaten in that kitchen for 40 years. He had set those 3 field stones in that fireplace. He had cut the counters low so she would not have to bend. Every board in it had come off ground they had cleared themselves. A stone cottage with modern plumbing could not compete with that, and they were old enough to stop pretending otherwise. So they went home, and they stayed there. We have just walked past 40 years, and 40 years is where the marriage actually lived. Most of what 2 people are to each other never gets written down. It happens in the ordinary running of a house, and nobody records it because nobody imagines anyone will ever ask. What survives from Rocky Ridge is mostly objects and paperwork. But objects and paperwork, read carefully, will tell you a great deal. Start with the orchard, because the orchard set the year. Ben Davis and Missouri Pippin are both keeping apples. They are not the apples you eat off the tree in September and rave about. They are hard, they store well, they travel, and they hold through winter in a cellar without turning. Nobody plants a hillside of keeping apples because they are delicious. You plant them because they can be sold in February. So the year had a shape, and the shape repeated for decades. Spring pruning and the risk of a late frost. Summer of watching. Then the picking, which is the one job on a fruit farm that cannot wait and cannot be done alone, and which for a man with bad legs meant ladders and meant help. Then the hauling into town. Then the winter and the cellar and selling into a market that wanted apples when nobody else had any. Underneath the fruit ran the dairy. Cows have to be milked twice a day, every day, forever. There is no holiday in a dairy and no such thing as a lie-in. Whatever else was happening on that farm in the good years and the bad ones, in the year the sun died and the year the books came out, somebody in that house got up in the dark and went to the barn. For most of those decades, both of them did. There were goats as well, and he kept them himself into his 80s, and there was a garden, and there were the horses, and there was a workshop. Almanzo did carpentry and woodwork on that place for the rest of his life. It is one of the constants in every account of him. A man whose legs had been taken at 31 spent the following 6 decades making things with his hands, sitting down where the legs did not matter. Nobody in that house wrote a plan. Nobody had a conversation about roles that anybody recorded. 2 people simply looked at what was left of him after 1888 and rebuilt the farm around it over years, without ever saying so. That is what long marriages actually are, and it is why they are almost impossible to put in a novel. There is no scene. There is only the accumulation. By the middle of the 1930s, they were 2 old people alone in a 10-room house. Think about that house for a moment. 6 rooms and a bath downstairs, a living room with a small library opening off it, a hall and 3 rooms upstairs. He had built it a room at a time across 18 years for a family, and the family was 2 people in their 70s and a daughter in Connecticut. There is a particular quiet that gets into a house like that, and it is not necessarily unhappy. It is the quiet of a place that was built bigger than the life that ended up in it. They filled it with books, which we know because the library is still there. They filled it with things he had made, and they went out. Once he learned to drive, and he was well into his 70s before that stopped, the 2 of them took long automobile trips, out to California, up into the Pacific Northwest, and back to South Dakota, to Smet, to look at the town. Picture that drive, because it is one of the most human things in this whole story. An old couple in a car in the 1930s, driving north and west over 800 miles of road to look at a small prairie town they had left in 1894 with nothing. He was in his 70s, she was in her 60s. Everything they had owned there had failed. Their son was buried there, in a plot nobody was completely certain of. And they got in a car and drove back to see it more than once. That is not nostalgia in the soft sense. That is 2 people who had survived something together going back to look at the ground where it happened, because it belonged to them. In Mansfield he had a friend named Silas Seal, and Silas had a wife named Nita, and the 4 of them were close for years. That friendship matters more than it sounds, and it will matter a great deal at the end of this story, because the Seals are among the handful of people who are actually in the room for what happened in that house. Nita Seal left a recorded account of Almanzo's death. Without her, we would know less than we do. A small farming town does a thing that is hard to explain to people who have not lived in one. It absorbs its old people. The Wilders had come to Mansfield as strangers in a wagon in 1894, and by the 1930s they had been there 40 years, and the town had simply closed around them. That is the fact that carries them through the last part of this story. Their only child lived in Connecticut, and there was no other family within 800 miles. What there was instead was Mansfield. Now, a word about money in 1929, because the popular version of this is wrong and it matters. The Wilders had savings by the late 20s, and some of it was invested through Rose's broker, and the crash hurt them. That much is true. But the story that the Great Depression wiped this family out and that Laura wrote the Little House books to keep bread on the table is not what the record shows. What the record shows is a family that took losses like most Americans took losses. They kept a working farm. They had a daughter earning a great deal of money, and they had an old woman in her 60s who had been a published writer for 20 years already, and who now had a reason to sit down and write the one thing she had never written, her own childhood. She started making notes in a cheap tablet in her 60s, in a farmhouse in Missouri, with her husband out in the yard with the goats. We're not going to spend the night on the books. That is a different story, and it has been told. What matters here is one thing about them. He was in them. The boy in Farmer Boy is him, at 9 years old, on his father's farm in New York State, eating and working and being cold. She wrote his childhood down and published it while he was alive to read it, and it came out in 1933 when he was 76. Think about what that is. She'd been married to him for 48 years, and she took the part of his life that happened before she ever met him. The part she only knew because he had told her about it across the decades. She wrote it into a book. It is still in print tonight, in every language you can name. He left no comment on it. He was not a man who wrote things down. But consider what had to happen for that book to exist. Farmer Boy is set in the 1860s, on a farm outside Malone, New York, on the Canadian border. Laura was not born until 1867, and she never lived in New York State. Every detail in that book came out of a man's memory and into a woman's ear, across a kitchen table in Missouri. The ox training, the ice harvest, the sheep shearing, and the cobbler who came to the house once a year, and the exact business of making butter for the New York market. For 48 years he had been telling her about his childhood. For 48 years she had been listening closely enough to reconstruct it. That is not a small thing about a marriage. Most people who have been married half a century could not write a publishable account of their spouse's 9th year. She could, and she did, and she got the details right enough that historians of 19th century farming still use the book. There is a version of the Wilder story in which Almanzo is the quiet, supporting figure, the patient husband in the background of a famous woman's life. That version is not wrong exactly, but it misses something. He is the only person in this story whose childhood got written down. Her own childhood became 8 books, his became 1, and his is the one she had no personal memory of, and had to build entirely out of what he had said to her over the decades, and she was in her 60s when she did it. They had been married 48 years when Farmer Boy came out. She was 66. He was 76. He got to hold it. And then there is the strange, quiet fact of the timing of all of it. The 8 books came out between 1932 and 1943. That is a span from her 65th year to her 76th, and from his 75th to his 86th. Every year of their marriage before 1932, all 47 of them, was lived in obscurity. Nobody outside Wright County, Missouri, and a farm paper readership had any reason to know either of their names. They did the 50-cent woodloads and the 7-year wait on apples, and the dead son and the burned house and the diphtheria entirely without an audience. And then, in the last 17 years of a 64-year marriage, the whole world learned who they were. Fame is a peculiar thing to arrive at 70. It changes almost nothing about the daily running of a house. There is evidence that they enjoyed it, in the way old people enjoy being told that something they did a long time ago mattered. But the cows still had to be milked. The goats still got out. The counters in the kitchen were still cut low. And the 2 of them were still, as they had been since 1885, the only 2 people in the room. But the last of the 8 books came out in 1943. He was 86 years old that year, and he had been walking with that cane for 55 of them. Every reader in America who knew his name knew it because his wife had put it there. There is a war on. That is easy to forget because the Little House books were being published straight through it, and they contain no wars. But the last of the 8 came out in 1943, and in 1943 every farm in America was operating under conditions it had not seen in a generation. The young men were gone. Farm labour, which had always been the thing you could buy when your own body would not do the work, simply vanished. Fuel was rationed. Rubber was rationed. Machinery could not be replaced. And on a hillside outside Mansfield there were 2 people running a fruit and dairy operation who were 76 and 86 years old. He had been walking with a cane since 1888. That is 55 years by then. There is a particular kind of arithmetic that arrives in a farming family at that point, and it does not need to be spoken aloud at the kitchen table because everybody already knows the numbers. Who is going to do the picking? There were no sons. There was 1 daughter, and she was 56 years old, childless, and living in Connecticut, and she was never coming back to run a farm. There was nobody to hand it to. I want to be careful here, because I cannot show you a letter in which they discuss this. No such letter has surfaced. What I can show you is the timing, and the timing is not ambiguous. In January of 1943 they began to sell the farm, not all at once, in pieces, over 5 years, to the same buyers, in a sequence that anyone who has watched an old couple wind down a place will recognise immediately. On the 18th of January 1943, they sold the rock house and 40 acres to their neighbours, a couple named Shorter. The terms were $50 a month. In the first days of November that year they sold 30 more acres. That deed sat in escrow for 5 years and was not recorded until November of 1948. And then, on the 20th of October 1948, they sold the last of it, the farmhouse and the remaining land, $2,000 down and $50 a month. He was 91 years old, she was 81, but there is a clause written into that final deed, and it is the reason we are reading a property record in the last act of a love story. They reserve the right to have and keep full and complete possession and use of the residence, barns, and all outbuildings and grounds connected therewith, for and during the natural life of both. For and during the natural life of both. That is the sentence. That is two people in their 80s and 90s selling everything they had built over 54 years and writing into the contract that nobody could put either of them out of that house while the other one was still breathing. They did not sell the farm and move to town. They did not sell the farm and go to a daughter. They sold the farm and stayed exactly where they were, on terms that made it legally impossible to be moved. He had carried the stones for that fireplace. He had cut those counters low. She had signed the first deed to that land in her own name in 1894, alone, when she was 27 years old and had $100. 54 years later, her name is on the last one too, and the last one says, "Nobody can make us leave." The 60th wedding anniversary fell on the 25th of August, 1945. I want to tell you what they did that day, and I cannot, because no record of it has survived. There is no newspaper item. There is no letter. The Mansfield paper of that period is not digitized, and whatever it printed that week is sitting on a reel of microfilm in a Missouri archive. 60 years of marriage, and the day itself is blank. That is not unusual. It is the ordinary condition of almost every long marriage that has ever existed. The world keeps the deeds and the death certificates. It does not keep the anniversaries, so we will simply note it. On the 25th of August 1945, in a farmhouse in Missouri, a man of 88 and a woman of 78 had been married for 60 years. The war had ended 11 days before. Nobody wrote anything down. The last years were quiet and they were not idle. He gardened. He kept his goats. He did his woodworking. He drove into Mansfield to see Silas Seal. There is a story people like to tell about these final years, and it goes that Laura kept all of Almanzo's things exactly as he had left them after he died. It is a beautiful image, and it is repeated constantly, and I could not find a single source for it anywhere. What is documented is something different, and it happened later, and we will come to it. In the early autumn of 1949, he became seriously ill. It lasted several weeks. He was 92 years old, and here we should correct something. There is a widespread account of Almanzo Wilder suffering a series of heart attacks through the 1930s and 40s, declining slowly across 2 decades. There is no documentary support for it that I can find, no dated episode, no hospital record, no letter. What the record actually holds is one illness at the very end in a man of 92. And by the 3rd week of October, he seemed to be getting better. The notice printed in the local paper afterwards puts it plainly. He was thought to be in an improved condition. On the morning of Sunday, the 23rd of October 1949, Almanzo James Wilder died at home at Rocky Ridge Farm, in the house he had built. That same notice contains one line I've not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. He died with only his wife, Laura Ingalls Wilder, with him at the time, only his wife. There was no doctor in the room. There were no children. There were no grandchildren, because there were none anywhere in the world. There was no nurse and no minister and no neighbour. There was a woman of 82, alone in a farmhouse in the Ozarks on a Sunday morning, with the man she had married in a front room in Dakota Territory when she was 18 years old. 64 years and 2 months, almost exactly. From the 25th of August, 1885, to the 23rd of October, 1949. And at the end of it, in the last minutes of it, the two of them were on their own, exactly as they had been for most of it. Rose was in Danbury, Connecticut, 1,200 miles away. She got there on the Wednesday night. She came into Springfield, Missouri, and a couple named Freeman met her train and drove her the 40 miles out to Mansfield. Wednesday. Her father died on Sunday morning. For 3 nights, Laura was in that house with the arrangements and the neighbours and their 92 years of him, and her only child had not arrived yet. I am not going to make that mean more than it does. 1,200 miles in 1949 took what it took, and Rose came as fast as anyone could come. But it is a fact about the shape of this family, and the shape had been set 44 years earlier, when an 18-year-old girl got on a train in Mansfield and did not come back to live. There were 2 of them in that house for 64 years, and one of them at the end, and the arithmetic never changed. The funeral was on the Friday, 2:00 in the afternoon, at the Methodist Church in Mansfield. The minister was a man named Carlton Knight. A local funeral home handled the arrangements. He was a mason, and his lodge was there. Then they took him up to the Mansfield cemetery and buried him. 64 years earlier, a congregational minister named Edward Brown had married them in his own front room, and Almanzo had put $10 in his hand and they had gone home. Now, a Methodist minister named Carlton Knight stood in front of a town that had known them for 55 years, and afterwards she went home alone. She was 82 years old and she had 7 years left. Here is what she did with them. She stayed. That is the whole answer, and it is more remarkable than it sounds. She was 82, widowed, childless in every practical sense, living 1.5 miles outside a small town, in a 10-room house on a hill, with no relatives closer than Connecticut. Every reasonable person in her position moves. She had a wealthy daughter with a house in the East and every reason to want her mother nearby. She did not go, she never went. She lived in that farmhouse for 7 more years, and she died in it. And the town did what small towns do. Netta Seal, who had been her friend and whose husband had been Almanzo's, was in and out. A man named Carl Hartley was around at the end. A couple called the Lichtys, Louis and Irene, had approached Laura a couple of years before Almanzo died about the idea of one day preserving the house, and they stayed close and eventually became the first people to look after it. A circle of neighbours simply formed around an old woman and held her up for 7 years, and she wrote letters. This is the part of her widowhood that is best documented and least dramatised. By 1949 she was one of the most beloved authors in the English-speaking world, and children wrote to her constantly, and she answered them. In her 80s, by hand, from a farmhouse. The dated letters that survive run right through it. There is one to a girl called Susanna in September of 1952, when Laura was 85. There is one to a neighbour called Dorothy in July of 1955, when she was 88. I would like to be able to read you a letter in which she describes what it was like to be alone in that house after 64 years. I cannot, and I want to be straight with you about why. There are lines that circulate attributed to her about grief and loneliness. I could not establish the date or the recipient of any of them. There is one sentence in her published correspondence that people reach for, and it is genuinely hers, and it is undated. You know a person cannot live at a high pitch of emotion, she wrote. The feelings become dulled by a natural unconscious effort at self-preservation. That may have been written in 1949. It may have been written 30 years earlier about something else entirely. I do not know, and neither does anybody who quotes it at you, so we are left with the actions, which are better evidence anyway. She stayed in his house. She kept his farm around her under a deed that said nobody could move her. She answered the letters of children who had grown up reading about a 9-year-old boy on a New York farm, a boy who had been her husband, whose childhood she had written down because he told it to her. Widowhood at 82 in 1949 was not what it is now. There was no television in that farmhouse for most of it. There was no air conditioning. The house was heated by fire. It was 1.5 miles out of town on a hill, and she didn't drive, which means that every single thing that reached her had to be brought. The mail came, that was the great constant. Sacks of it, from children, from schools, from women her own age who had read the books to their daughters. And she sat in a house he had built and answered them by hand, in her 80s, in a small, careful script, one at a time. Neighbours brought groceries. Netta Seal came out. People from the town drove up the hill on ordinary errands and stayed to talk, and it is clear from every account that they organised themselves around her without anybody ever putting it in those terms. She had money by then, which she had not had for most of her life. The books earned. She could have hired anything or gone anywhere. She stayed on the hill and answered her letters, and at some point during those years, an old woman alone in a house that legally belonged to somebody else began to think about what would happen to it. The Lichtys had first raised the idea before Almanzo died. Louis Lichty had come to Laura around 1947 and talked about preserving the place. She had not committed to anything, and she did not have the standing to, because the deeds were already signed and the life estate ran only as long as she did. But she knew the conversation had happened. She lived 7 years knowing that some of her neighbours thought the house should be kept, and knowing that when she died it would legally go to the Shorters, and she does not appear to have done anything about it. I find that restraint remarkable. She could have bought it back. She could have written it into a will. Instead, she left it exactly where the paper had put it and got on with the letters. And in the middle of those 7 years, something happened that almost nobody remembers, and it is one of the strangest honours ever paid to an American writer. In June of 1954, the Children's Librarians of the United States created a new award for lasting and substantial contribution to literature for children. They named it the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, and then they gave it to Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was 87 years old. She had been a widow for nearly 5 years. She was living alone in a farmhouse outside a town of 1,000 people, answering letters from children by hand. And the profession that decides what books American children will be handed sat down and named the standard of greatness in their field after her. A woman who had published her first book at 65, after a lifetime of poultry and apples and farm loans. The award ran under her name for 64 years, from 1954 to 2018, which is very nearly the exact length of her marriage. She was there to see it happen. That matters. Most people who get something named after them are not. I would love to tell you what she said about it. There is no quotation I can verify, so I will not give you one. What I can tell you is that she took the medal home to the farmhouse, and that the farmhouse is where it stayed, and that she had not quite 3 more years. In the autumn of 1956 she got very ill. She was 89. It was diabetes that had not been properly diagnosed, and her heart. They took her to a hospital in Springfield. Rose came at Thanksgiving and stayed about 3 months. She found her mother confused and slipping. It is the longest stretch of time the two of them had spent together in decades, and it happened at the very end, in the way these things usually do. Laura wanted to go home, and they took her home, the day after Christmas. On the 7th of February, 1957, she turned 90 years old. 3 days later, on the 10th of February, she died in her sleep, in the farmhouse, in the bed. The death certificate gives cerebral hemorrhage due to hypertension and arteriosclerosis. The informant named on it is Rose Lane of Danbury, Connecticut. They buried her on the 13th of February 1957 in the Mansfield cemetery beside him. She had outlived him by 7 years and 3 months. She had been Laura Ingalls for 18 years and Laura Ingalls Wilder for 71. There are 3 more things. The first is the house. When Laura died, that final deed did exactly what it had been written to do, and not 1 day longer. The life estate was for the natural life of both. Both were now gone. The farmhouse and the land reverted to the Shorters, who had bought it fairly and waited 9 years, and who now owned an empty 10-room house on a hill outside Mansfield, with all the Wilders' belongings still in it. The town would not have it. A group of Mansfield men, led by Lewis Lichty, went to Rose, and Rose Wilder Lane wrote a cheque for $7,500. The woman who had hated that hillside, who had written that her childhood there was a nightmare, who had said that if she'd ever made the best of things she would have been stuck in Mansfield yet. It bought her parents' house and 3 acres around it. On Sunday, the 19th of May, 1957, the Laura Ingalls Wilder home opened its doors to the public for the first time. 500 people came. 3 months and 9 days after she died, 500 people walked up that hill and through the front door and into the rooms. And here is the thing that was done. And it is the documented version of that story about keeping his belongings untouched. They did not restore the house. They preserved it. The contents were left where they were, not arranged for display, not sourced from antique dealers, not a reconstruction of what such a house might have contained, the actual objects in the actual places as the two of them had left them. That is why the kitchen counters are still low. People walk into that room every summer and notice that something is wrong with the height of the work surfaces. Somebody tells them why. And a man who died in 1949 does one more considerate thing for his wife. And there is one more thing, and it concerns her wishes, and it did not go the way she wanted. Laura's will left the proceeds of her books to Rose for the term of Rose's natural life. After that, they were to go to the public library in Mansfield. That is a very characteristic decision. The daughter first, for as long as she lived. Then the small-town library on the square in the town that had taken them in when they arrived with a wagon. It did not happen that way. When the copyrights came up for renewal, Rose renewed them in her own name. And when Rose died in 1968, she left the entire literary estate not to the Mansfield Library, but to Roger Lee McBride, a young man who had been her protégé and her lawyer, and whom she treated as a kind of adopted grandson, and who was not related to any of them. The library received one cheque for $28,000. 31 years later, in December of 1999, the library board went to federal court over it. The case settled in the spring of 2001. The terms were not made public. So the 8 books that came out of that farmhouse have earned, over 90 years, an amount of money nobody can easily calculate. And almost none of it went where the woman who wrote them said it should go. She had put her own name on a deed in 1894 when almost no married woman did. She had run a county's loan books. She had earned the money that kept that farm through 2 depressions. And the one instruction she left about where it should end up was quietly set aside within a decade of her death by the only person she had left to trust. That is not a scandal exactly. Rose was her daughter, the estate was legally hers for life, and the renewal was lawful. But it is the last fact in the story, and it belongs here, because it completes something. Everything this marriage built was held by 2 people and then by 1, and there was nobody after that. The second thing is the glass. Do you remember the bread plate? Pressed glass out of Pittsburgh, wheat heads around the rim. Give us this day our daily bread. Bought by a young husband for a young wife in their first married winter in Dakota Territory in 1885, when they had a new house and good land and every reason to think it was going to work. It came through the fire of 1889, when almost nothing else did. It went to Minnesota, it went to Florida, it came back to Dakota. It went 650 miles in a wagon in the summer of 1894, wrapped in something, in the back, with a 7-year-old girl and a $100 bill that everybody thought was lost. It sat in a log house by a spring, then in one added room, then in a kitchen with counters cut low, then in a 10-room farmhouse for 55 years. It is in a case in Mansfield tonight. Every single thing that Plate promised failed at least once. They did not get their daily bread in 1888, or in 1889, or in Florida, or in the years of 50-cent wood loads. And they kept the Plate anyway, through 4 states and 9 addresses and 6 decades, and it is the only object in this entire story that was present at both ends of the marriage. The third thing is the line. They had 2 children. Rose, born in a claim shanty in December of 1886, and a son, born in the 2nd week of July, 1889, 10 pounds, healthy, who lived about 4 weeks and died on the 7th of August and was never given a name. Rose had 1 child, a son, born prematurely and dead at birth in 1909. Surgery afterwards meant there would not be another. Rose Wilder Lane died in her sleep on the 30th of October 1968 at Danbury, Connecticut. She was 81. She had a world tour booked and was to leave in the morning. They brought her back to Missouri and buried her beside her mother and her father. 3 graves in the Mansfield Cemetery and no descendants anywhere on earth. So that is the marriage. 64 years and 2 months, 4 states, 9 addresses, 1 buried son, 1 dead grandson, 1 daughter who loved them and could not live near them, a homestead lost, a preemption lost, a house burned, a disease that took a young man's legs and left him a cane for 61 years, 50-cent loads of firewood, 7 years of waiting on apple trees, a 10-room house built by hand by a man who could not walk properly, with the counters cut low, a woman who published her first paid words at 43 and her first book at 65. $1 million of other people's loans passing across her desk, a deed in her name in 1894 and a deed in her name in 1948, and between them, everything. The 8 books end on the 25th of August, 1885, with a girl in a black cashmere dress riding out to a new little house. The last page of that book is about the evening star and the fiddle and being content. It is a beautiful ending, and it is where nearly everyone who loves this story stops. But what came after it was 64 years long, and it contained more grief and more work and more ordinary daily loyalty than the 8 books put together. She never wrote it. I have thought about why, and I do not think it was because she was hiding anything. I think it is simpler and sadder than that. The books were about a childhood, and a childhood has a shape, and she knew how to write it. A marriage does not have a shape. A marriage is 64 years of 2 people getting up in the dark to milk cows, rearranging a farm around a bad pair of legs, putting the right name on a deed, driving 800 miles in an old car to look at a town where everything went wrong. There is no way to end that story except the way it actually ended, on a Sunday morning in October, in a room with 2 people in it, one of whom stopped. The last thing we can say for certain is a sentence she wrote on their 30th wedding anniversary, on a train in the mountains, going west without him. I wish you were here. Half the fun I lose because I am all the time wishing for you. She had 34 more years of him after she wrote that. Then 7 years and 3 months without. He had leaned on that cane since 1888. 61 years. He built a 10-room house with it propped against a wall. He cut the kitchen counters low. He bred horses with good feet to withstand the stony roads. And he drove her 800 miles in an old car to look at a town where everything had gone wrong. Then they put her in the ground beside him, on a hill above a town that had taken them in when they had nothing, on the 13th of February 1957. The counters in that kitchen are still low. Good night.